The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was the largest structure ever built by any species in the known universe. Its walls stretched upward for nearly a mile and were made of living crystal that pulsed with soft blue light. 17 different species had gathered here today, and their representatives sat in curved benches that rose like waves around the central platform. The air smelled different depending on where you stood because each section was climate-controlled for its occupants. Some areas were hot and dry, while others were cold and damp, and a few were filled with gases that would kill a human in seconds. Ambassador Grace Miller stood alone on the central platform. She was a tall woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair that she kept tied back in a practical knot. Her diplomatic uniform was pressed and perfect, but she felt very small standing there beneath the gaze of beings who had ruled the stars for longer than humanity had existed as a species. She kept her hands clasped behind her back to hide the slight trembling in her fingers. High Arbiter Hal rose from his seat at the head of the assembly. He was a crystalline, and his body was made of the same living material as the walls around them. Light passed through his form and scattered into rainbows across the floor. His voice did not come from a mouth because he had none. Instead, it resonated directly in the minds of everyone present through the translator implants that all council members were required to carry. "The verdict has been reached," Hal announced. His mental voice was cold and carried the weight of absolute authority. The species known as humanity has been found guilty on 3 counts. First, they have committed territorial aggression by expanding beyond their allocated boundaries. Second, they have pursued unauthorized technological advancement in violation of species development protocols. Third, they have repeatedly refused to submit to council oversight and population limitations. Grace wanted to object. She wanted to point out that humanity had only expanded because their home system was overcrowded, and that their technological research had been conducted in full compliance with every treaty they had signed. She wanted to remind the council that humanity had never started a single conflict and had only defended themselves when attacked. But the rules of this chamber did not permit interruptions, and she had learned long ago that the council was not interested in human excuses. "The sentence is expulsion," Hal continued. "Effective immediately, all human colonies are to be evacuated. All human vessels are to withdraw beyond the outer rim boundary. Humanity is hereby stripped of council membership and all associated rights and protections. You have 90 standard cycles to comply." A murmur rippled through the assembly. The delegation made clicking sounds with their mandibles that Grace recognized as satisfaction. There were creatures who stood nearly 8 feet tall and had been humanity's most vocal opponents since first contact. The who were beings of pure light contained in magnetic fields hummed with frequencies that suggested amusement. Even species that Grace had considered friendly were nodding their approval. 32 years of diplomatic work had just been erased in a matter of minutes. Grace had spent her entire adult life building bridges between humanity and the galactic community. She had negotiated trade agreements and cultural exchanges and scientific partnerships. She had believed that if humanity proved itself peaceful and productive, then eventually they would be accepted as equals. She had been naive. "May I respond?" Grace asked. Her voice was steady despite the turmoil inside her. "You may not," Hal replied. "The decision is final and binding. Your species is young and violent and dangerous. You lack the wisdom to understand your place in the greater order of things. Perhaps in another 1,000 years, when you have learned proper humility, you may petition for reconsideration. Until then, you are to remove yourselves from civilized space and trouble us no more." Grace nodded slowly. She looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives of civilizations that had mastered interstellar travel when humans were still living in caves. These beings had technology that seemed like magic and measured in centuries and knowledge accumulated over millions of years. And they had just told humanity to go away and die quietly in some forgotten corner of the galaxy. "Then I have only one thing to say," Grace replied. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin. You will regret this." She turned and walked toward the exit. The sound of her footsteps echoed against the crystal floor. Behind her, she heard what passed for laughter among the various alien species. They found her words amusing. What could humanity possibly do to make the mighty Galactic Council regret anything? Humans had one system and 43 colony ships and technology that the Council considered barely adequate for crossing the void between stars. The doors closed behind her with a sound like thunder. 8 hours later, Grace stood in the office of Admiral Brooks at United Earth Command headquarters in Geneva. Was 62 years old with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and gray eyes that had seen too many friends die. He had commanded humanity's defense forces for 15 years, and he had always known this day would come. The recording of Grace's final moments in the council chamber played on the screen behind his desk. When it finished, sat in silence for a long moment. 90 days, he said finally. They gave us 90 days to abandon everything we have built. They do not expect us to survive, Grace replied. She was sitting across from him and she looked exhausted. The journey back from council space had taken 6 days and she had not slept for most of them. They think we will scatter and fade away, that we will become a footnote in galactic history. Turned his chair to face the window. Outside, the sun was setting over the Alps and the sky was painted in shades of orange and red. Somewhere up there among the stars were 27 human colonies with nearly 200 million people. Men and women and children who had built homes and businesses and communities on worlds that the Council had now declared off limits. "Get me Director Samuel Palmer at Advanced Research," said, "an admiral at the Jupiter shipyards. We need to move up the timeline." Grace frowned. What timeline? Did not answer immediately. He watched the last sliver of sun disappear below the mountains and then he turned back to face her. "For the past decade we have been working on something the Council does not know about. We called it Project Exodus because we always knew this day might come. But there is a companion program, something we hoped we would never need." "What is it called?" Grace asked. "Project Dominion." The name hung in the air between them. Grace felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the room. She said slowly, "What exactly have you been building?" He stood and walked to the window again. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened glass. "An answer," he said. "The Council thinks humanity is weak and primitive and helpless. They are about to learn how wrong they are." 2 weeks later, in a classified facility, buried deep beneath the surface of Mars, a group of 50 people gathered in a conference room that officially did not exist. They were the best scientists and engineers and military strategists that humanity had to offer. They had been working in secret for years on technologies that the Council had declared impossible. Dr. Samuel Palmer stood at the front of the room. He was a thin man in his 70s with wild white hair and eyes that sparkled with barely contained excitement. The holographic display behind him showed equations and schematics that would have baffled the greatest minds of previous generations. "Ladies and," Palmer began, "for 15 years we have been told that Council technology represents the absolute limit of what is possible. Their fold drives and their weapons and their shields are supposedly the best that physics allows. Every young species is told this. We were told this." He tapped a control and the display changed. "They lied." The room went silent. Admiral Brooks leaned forward in his seat. Palmer continued, "The Council uses fold drives to travel between stars. They bend space and slip through the gap. They claim the energy requirements make anything faster impossible, but we have found an alternative. We call it slip space. Instead of bending space, we slide between dimensional layers. The physics are completely different, and the results are remarkable." He brought up a comparison chart. "Their fastest ships travel approximately 50 light-years per day. Our prototype achieved 200 in its first test flight, and we have barely begun to optimize the system." Admiral Brooks felt something he had not felt in years: hope. How long until this is ready for the fleet? He asked. If we have unlimited resources and full priority access to every manufacturing facility on Earth and Mars, and the Moon then 18 months. You have 12, Brooks replied. Make it happen. As the meeting ended, Grace Miller found in the corridor. You know what this means, she said. Even if we run, they will come for us eventually. The Council cannot allow a species to exist outside their control. I know, replied. So what is the plan? We cannot fight them. They have 10,000 warships. We have 18. Stopped walking and turned to face her. His granite features softened just slightly. For now we have 18, he said, but not forever. The Council has grown lazy after of dominance. They have forgotten what it means to face an enemy with nothing to lose. He paused. We are going to remind them. The evacuation of Earth's colonies began 3 days later. To outside observers, it looked like compliance. Human ships retreated from their settlements and gathered at designated points for transport beyond the rim. Council observers watched with satisfaction as the troublesome young species packed up and prepared to leave. What they did not see were the underground bunkers being sealed with supplies for years of hiding. They did not see the weapons caches being buried or the communication networks being established. They did not see the volunteers who stayed behind with orders to wait. On the colony world of Havens, rest a young engineer named Daniel Torres said goodbye to his wife Lisa and their 2 children. I will find you, he promised her as she boarded the transport. When this is over, I will come for you. How long? She asked. Her eyes were red from crying. I do not know, but I will find you, I swear it. He watched the ship lift off and disappear into the clouds. Then he walked to the hidden entrance of the bunker that would be his home for however long it took. 300 other volunteers waited inside. They were farmers and teachers and shopkeepers and engineers, ordinary people who had chosen to stay behind because someone had to. The resistance was ready. Now all they had to do was wait. The Exodus fleet gathered at the edge of known space like a school of fish fleeing from predators. 217 ships of every size and shape hung in the darkness between stars. There were passenger liners and cargo haulers and mining vessels and research platforms. There were ships that had been designed for short hops between planets now loaded with supplies for a journey that might never end. Nearly 3 million humans looked out through portholes, and at the galaxy they were leaving behind. Admiral Brooks stood on the bridge of the command ship Endeavour and studied the tactical display. The destination was a system the Council had centuries ago and dismissed as worthless. A yellow star with 6 planets and 2 moons that might support life with enough work. The Council species preferred worlds that were already perfect. They had never understood the human willingness to transform hostile environments into homes. Begin jump sequence ordered. All ships synchronize on my mark. The fleet moved as one. The new slip space drives engaged and reality twisted around them. To outside observers, the ships simply vanished as if they had never existed. There was no flash of light and no ripple in space. They were there, and then they were not. 12 hours later, the fleet emerged in orbit around a world that would become humanity's new home. Looked down at the planet through the main. It was not beautiful. The atmosphere was thin and the surface was by ancient volcanic activity. The oceans were small and the vegetation was sparse. But there was water and there was air and there was land. Everything else could be built. Welcome to New Eden, he said quietly, our new beginning. The colonization effort began immediately. Humans had learned something about themselves during their brief time among the stars. They were exceptionally good at building things quickly when survival depended on it. Other species took decades to establish new colonies. Humans threw themselves into the work with a desperate energy that seemed almost insane. Within 2 months, the first permanent structures were complete. Within 4 months, the population had expanded from 3 million to 5 million as the remaining evacuation ships arrived. Within 6 months, the underground manufacturing facilities were operational, and producing everything from construction materials to medicine to weapons. Dr. Samuel Palmer oversaw the scientific efforts from a laboratory complex carved into the side of a mountain. His team worked around the clock to refine the slip space technology and develop new systems that would give humanity the edge they needed. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford. The first warship produced entirely at New Eden rolled out of the shipyards 8 months after colonization began. It was called the Defiance, and it was unlike anything humanity had ever built before. The hull was sleek and angular and made of alloys that the Council had declared theoretically impossible. The weapon systems drew power from reactors that should not have worked according to established physics. The slip space drive at its core could move the ship faster than anything in the Council arsenal. Ambassador Grace Miller attended the launch ceremony. She stood beside Admiral Brooks as the massive vessel rose into the amber sky and climbed toward the stars. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is necessary," replied, "the first of many." "How many can we build?" "At current production capacity, we can complete 12 ships per month, but we are expanding every week. Within a year, we will have 200 vessels. Within 2 years, perhaps 1,000. Grace shook her head in disbelief. The Council took centuries to build their fleet. The Council was never in a hurry. They never had someone threatening to wipe them from existence. He turned to look at her. "Fear is a powerful motivator, Grace, but so is anger, and right now humanity has plenty of both." Back on the occupied colonies, the resistance waited. Daniel Torres had counted every day since his family left. 732 days of hiding underground. 732 days of recycled air and artificial light, and the constant fear of discovery. They had arrived 6 months after the evacuation. They had claimed the abandoned human worlds as compensation for what they called crimes against galactic peace. Their troops had torn through the empty cities looking for anything valuable. They had found empty buildings and broken equipment, and nothing that mattered. The humans had taken everything important with them, or buried it where it would never be found. Captain Amy commanded the resistance cell on Haven's Rest. She was a small woman with short black hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. Before the expulsion, she had been a tactical officer on a patrol ship. Now she was responsible for 300 lives in a bunker that grew smaller with each passing day. "Any word from command?" Daniel asked her one evening. They were in the communications room, which was really just a closet with some equipment that Daniel had built from salvaged parts. "Nothing new," Amy replied. "Radio silence is still in effect. We transmit only in emergencies." Daniel nodded. He understood the reasons. Any communication could be detected and traced. The resistance was only valuable if the Council did not know it existed. But the waiting was hard, not knowing if the fleet had survived or if help would ever come. 2 years, he said. "We have been down here for 2 years. I know. My children will not remember me." He stared at the blank screens. "My daughter was 4 when they left. She will be 6 now. She will not know my face." Amy put a hand on his shoulder. "She will know your name," she said. "She will know that her father stayed behind to fight for their future. That matters." "Does it?" "Yes, it does." In the great chamber of the Galactic Council, life continued as if humanity had never existed. High Arbiter Hal presided over meetings where the distribution of former human colonies was discussed, and trade agreements were negotiated, and minor disputes between species were settled. The humans were mentioned occasionally as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened to young species who refused to accept their place in the natural order. They were particularly pleased with their new territories. They had expanded their empire by nearly 10% without firing a single shot. Their ambassador made frequent speeches about the superiority of civilization and the inevitable decline of warm-blooded species. They watched and waited. They were one of the oldest species in the Council, and they had seen many things over the They had seen empires rise and fall. They had seen species that seemed invincible crumble into dust, and they had learned that the universe had a way of surprising those who grew too comfortable. "The humans are quiet," the ambassador observed during a private reception. "Too quiet." "They are gone," the representative replied, "fled to some worthless system beyond the rim. In a few generations they will be extinct." "Perhaps," said, "or perhaps not. They were a stubborn species. Stubborn and inventive and very, very determined." Determined to do what? They had nothing, no fleet, no allies, no future. Flickered with colors that suggested amusement. "That is exactly what concerns me." On New Eden the fleet continued to grow. 100 ships, then 150, then 200. Each vessel was more advanced than the last as the engineers learned from every test flight and every simulation and every failure. Admiral Brooks conducted war games that pushed his crews to their limits. He studied council tactics and identified weaknesses. He developed strategies that would maximize the advantages of human technology while minimizing the numerical disparity they faced. He prepared for a war that everyone knew was coming. Ambassador Miller worked on a different kind of warfare. She sent secret envoys to species that had shown sympathy for humanity during the expulsion hearings. She offered trade agreements and technology sharing and mutual defense pacts. She planted seeds of doubt about the Council's true intentions. Not everyone in the galaxy was happy with Council rule. Many species resented the restrictions placed on their development. Many remembered the wars of conquest that had brought their ancestors under Council control. Many looked at humanity's defiance and saw a possibility they had never considered before. What if the Council could be challenged? What if things could be different? 2 years and 3 months after the expulsion, the human fleet numbered 212 warships. They were faster and more powerful than anything the Council possessed. They were crewed by men and women who had lost their homes and their futures, and who burned with a cold fury that nothing could extinguish. Admiral Brooks gathered his senior officers in the war room. "It is time," he said. "The Council thinks we are dead. They think we are scattered and broken and forgotten. Today we show them how wrong they are." He activated the tactical display. It showed the 12 former human colonies now occupied by Council forces. 300 resistance fighters were hidden across those worlds, waiting for a signal that was 2 years overdue. "Operation Homecoming begins at 0600 tomorrow," Brooks continued. "We take back what is ours, and then we make them pay for every day our people spent hiding in darkness." The officers exchanged glances. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the moment they had sacrificed everything to reach. Grace Miller spoke from her seat at the end of the table. "And after that," she asked, "what comes after we take back the colonies?" Brooks met her gaze. "After that," he said, "we change the galaxy forever." The patrol squadron detected the anomaly at 3:47 local time on what would later be known as Liberation Day. 7 ships had appeared at the edge of the Haven's rest system without any warning. There had been no flash of energy that indicated a fold drive exit. There had been no gravitational disturbance. The ships had simply materialized as if stepping through an invisible door. Commander Tal studied the sensor readings with all 4 of his compound eyes. He had been patrolling this system for 18 months, and nothing interesting had ever happened. The humans were gone, and the system was secure, and his duties consisted mainly of making sure no one stole mining equipment from the surface. Probably smugglers, he decided, or perhaps lost traders from one of the minor species who had wandered into restricted space by accident. Either way, it would provide some entertainment during an otherwise boring shift. "Move to intercept," he ordered, "all weapons hot." His squadron consisted of 12 warships. They were older models but still more than capable of handling smugglers or pirates. The Navy had not faced a real challenge in centuries, and Tal saw no reason why today would be different. He was wrong. The human ships moved with a speed that his sensors could barely track. One moment they were at the edge of the system, and the next they were among his formation. Their weapons fired beams of energy that passed through shields as if they did not exist. His ships began exploding around him, and he had barely processed what was happening before a beam struck his own bridge. The last thing Commander Tal saw was fire. On the surface of Haven's Rest, Daniel Torres was repairing a water recycler when his communicator crackled to life. He had almost forgotten he was carrying it. After 2 years of silence, it had become more habit than hope. "All resistance cells, this is the Defiance," a voice announced. "Liberation has begun. Emerge at designated coordinates for extraction." Daniel dropped his tools and ran. He sprinted through the bunker corridors, shouting at everyone he passed, "They are here. They came back. Get to the surface." 300 people who had spent 2 years living like moles scrambled to gather their equipment and reach the exit tunnels. Some were crying. Some were laughing. Most were doing both. They had waited so long. They had begun to wonder if this day would ever come. Captain Amy led them to the surface. The sky was still dark, but she could see flashes of light high above where the battle was ending. Human were descending through the atmosphere, their hulls glowing from the heat of entry. The liberation of Haven's Rest had begun. The ground assault was surgical and devastating. Human Marines landed at strategic points across the planet and overwhelmed the defenders within hours. The occupiers had grown complacent during 2 years of peaceful garrison duty. They were not prepared for enemies who moved faster and hit harder than anything they had ever faced. By dawn, it was over. The human flag flew once again over the capital of Haven's Rest. Similar scenes played out across all 12 occupied colonies over the following week as the human fleet struck with precision and overwhelming force. The Galactic Council received word of the attacks through emergency communications from their retreating forces. High Arbiter Hal convened an emergency session in the Great Chamber, where the emergency lights cast harsh shadows across the crystalline walls. "Impossible," Hal declared. "They were expelled, they were nothing. How can they have done this?" The intelligence reports were terrifying. Human ships that appeared and disappeared without using fold drives. Weapons that bypassed standard shielding. Ground forces equipped with technology that made Council military hardware look primitive. "They have not merely survived," the intelligence director reported. "They have advanced, significantly." "Then we will crush them," the ambassador snarled. His mandibles clicked with fury. "Send the Third Armada. We will remind these vermin why they should have stayed hidden." The Third Armada was the largest single fleet the Council had mobilized in over 1,000 years. 800 warships under the command of Grand Admiral, who had earned his reputation crushing rebellions across a dozen star systems. He had never lost a battle, and he did not intend to start now. The two fleets met in the empty space between stars at a location that humanity would later name the Threshold. Admiral Brooks commanded the human force of 150 ships from the bridge of the Defiance. The odds were not in his favor, but he had long ago learned that numbers were not everything. "Admiral, the enemy fleet is in weapons range," his tactical officer reported. "They are deploying in standard Council attack formation." Brooks studied the holographic display that showed the enemy positions. 800 ships arranged in precise geometric patterns that had been developed over of galactic warfare. It was an impressive sight. It was also predictable. "All ships execute pattern Omega," he ordered. The human fleet split into 12 independent groups that scattered in seemingly random directions. To the Council commanders watching from their bridges, it looked like panic. It looked like a broken formation fleeing from superior numbers. Grand Admiral ordered pursuit. His ships broke formation to chase the retreating humans. It was exactly what Brooks had expected. Human vessels began appearing behind the Council ships. They would emerge from slip space, fire a devastating barrage, and vanish before return fire could connect. The Council fleet found itself surrounded by enemies that refused to stay in one place long enough to target. "What are they doing?" demanded. "How are they moving like that?" No one could answer him. The technology the humans were using did not exist according to everything the Council knew about physics. Ships were not supposed to be able to appear and disappear at will. Weapons were not supposed to ignore shields. The rules of warfare that had held for 100,000 years were being rewritten in real time. The Battle of the Threshold lasted 6 hours. It was the largest naval engagement since the founding of the Council, and it was a disaster for every species except humanity. When the fighting ended, the Third Armada had been reduced to 200 ships, and all of them were fleeing for Council space. Human losses stood at 23 vessels. Admiral Brooks stood on the bridge of the Defiance watching the enemy retreat. His uniform was torn, and his face was covered in soot from an electrical fire that had broken out during the battle. But his eyes burned with satisfaction. "Send a message to the Council," he said. "Tell them this. We did not start this war, but we will finish it." The message reached the Great Chamber within hours. It was played on the main display for all the assembled species to see. Admiral Brooks spoke in simple, clear terms. He outlined the injustice of humanity's expulsion. He detailed the occupation of their colonies. He described the resistance fighters who had spent 2 years hiding in darkness. And he made a promise. "We offered you peace and you gave us exile. We offered you friendship and you gave us contempt. We asked only for a place among the stars and you tried to push us into oblivion. Now we are coming, not to conquer, not to enslave, but to create a new order where no species is forced to bow before another." The recording ended. The chamber fell silent. High Arbiter Hal felt something he had not experienced in centuries: fear. The humans were supposed to be primitive. They were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to fade away and die. Instead, they had returned stronger than ever, and they had broken the greatest fleet the Council had ever assembled. "What do we do?" the ambassador asked. His earlier confidence had evaporated. "We fight," Hal replied. "We gather every ship we have and we crush them before they grow any stronger." But the Council was no longer unified. Species that had been loyal began to question whether they were on the right side of history. They announced their withdrawal from military operations. Several smaller species followed. Cracks that had been invisible for centuries suddenly became impossible to ignore. On New Eden, Ambassador Grace Miller received the news of the victory with mixed emotions. Thousands had died in the battle. Ships had been lost. Families had been shattered. But they had won, and that meant something. "They want to talk," she told Admiral Brooks when he returned from the front lines. "They are sending an ambassador." Brooks raised an eyebrow. "Though they helped expel us." "They are also the oldest species in the Council. They remember things that others have forgotten, and I think they see which way the wind is blowing." "What do they want?" "Alliance. They say there are others who feel the same way. Species who have chafed under Council rule for centuries. Species who watched our rebellion and saw hope." Brooks considered this for a long moment. "We cannot fight the entire Council alone," he said finally. "Even with our technology, the numbers are against us. If we can turn some of them to our side, then maybe we have a chance." Grace nodded. "That is exactly what I was thinking." The war for the galaxy had only just begun, but humanity was no longer alone. The ambassador arrived at New Eden 3 weeks after the Battle of the Threshold. Her name was, and she was ancient even by the standards of her species. Her body was made of light contained within a magnetic field that shifted through colors no human eye could properly perceive. She had witnessed the founding of the Galactic Council nearly 100,000 years ago, and she had grown tired of what it had become. Ambassador Miller met her in a specially constructed chamber that could accommodate her unique physiology. They sat across from each other, separated by a table made of transparent crystal. "You surprised us," began. Her voice resonated through translation devices that converted her light patterns into sound. We did not expect humanity to survive, let alone return stronger than before. We surprised ourselves, Grace admitted. When they expelled us, we had nothing. We built everything from scratch in the darkness beyond the rim. That is precisely what intrigued us. The Council has spent convincing young species that advancement is impossible without their guidance. You proved that was a lie, and now others are beginning to wonder what else the Council has lied about. Grace leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing? Alliance, not just with but with 7 other species who share our views. Together, we represent nearly a quarter of Council space. Our fleets combined with yours would shift the balance of power significantly. And in exchange, recognition, equality, a voice in whatever new order emerges from this conflict. We are tired of bowing to the crystallines we want something better. The negotiations lasted 2 weeks, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Free Worlds Alliance was formally announced on the first anniversary of the liberation. 8 species standing together against the Council that had dominated the galaxy since the beginning of recorded history. High Arbiter Hal watched the broadcast of the announcement from his private chambers. His crystalline form had developed cracks that had not been there a year ago. Stress was taking its toll on even his ancient body. Traitors, he muttered, all of them traitors and fools. His advisors had urged caution. They had suggested negotiation. They had pointed out that humanity's technology gave them advantages that could not be overcome through numbers alone. Hal had rejected all of it. The Council had ruled for 100,000 years, and it would not fall to upstart mammals and their collection of malcontents. But the war went badly from the start. Human fleets struck at Council installations across the galaxy. They appeared without warning, destroyed their targets, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. The shipyards at Prime fell in a single day. The fortress World of was besieged for 2 months before its garrison surrendered. Supply lines were cut, and communications were disrupted, and the carefully ordered structure of Council space began to crumble. The Free Worlds Alliance provided more than just ships. They provided intelligence about Council weaknesses and defectors from within the military establishment and safe harbors where human vessels could repair and resupply. What had begun as a rebellion was becoming something far larger. Admiral Brooks commanded the campaign from the Bridge of the Defiance. He had aged 10 years in the past too, and there were nights when the faces of everyone who had died under his command visited him in his dreams. But he could not stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. The Council is requesting negotiations, Grace told him one morning. They want a ceasefire. Brooks shook his head. Not until Hal is gone. He will never accept peace on any terms we can live with. This ends with him or it ends with us. He was right. The peace offer was a trick designed to buy time for the Council to rebuild its forces. When human intelligence uncovered the deception, Brooks responded by accelerating the offensive. But the Council had one final card to play. Deep in the most heavily defended system in the galaxy, a weapon had been sleeping for nearly 60,000 years. The crystallines had built it during a war so ancient that most species had forgotten it ever happened. They called it the World Ender, and it was designed to destabilize stars, triggering supernovas that would sterilize entire systems. Hal had sworn never to use it. The weapon was too terrible, too indiscriminate, too destructive. But desperation had erased his scruples. If the Council could not rule the galaxy, then perhaps no one would. Activate the silence protocol, he ordered. The World Ender began to power up. Its target was New Eden. Human intelligence discovered the activation within hours. Dr. Samuel Palmer delivered the briefing personally to Admiral Brooks and Ambassador Miller in the war room. The weapon draws power from the star it is designed to destroy, he explained. Once it reaches full charge, there is no way to stop it. We have approximately 72 hours before it fires. Can we destroy it? Brooks asked. The installation is surrounded by the largest concentration of Council warships remaining. Even if we committed our entire fleet, we might not break through in time. And even if we did, the weapon itself is shielded by technology we do not fully understand. So we do nothing, Grace said. We just wait to die. Palmer shook his head. There may be another option. The world ender requires enormous power. If we could disrupt the primary conduits that channel energy from the star, even briefly, the weapon would shut down. How? By inserting a small team directly into the installation. A stealth approach, while our main fleet provides a distraction. That is a suicide mission, Brooks said. Probably, Palmer agreed, but it is also our only chance. Captain Cole volunteered before the briefing ended. He was 34 years old with no family and a reputation as the best pilot in the fleet. He had flown missions that should have been impossible and survived situations that should have been fatal. Why you? Brooks asked him privately. Because someone has to, Cole replied. And I would rather it be someone who chose this than someone who had it forced on them. The mission was designated Operation Last Light. Cole handpicked 11 crew members for the infiltration ship. They were all volunteers. They all knew the odds. None of them hesitated. The main fleet launched a diversionary attack that drew the bulk of Council forces away from the target system. Cole guided his small vessel through the gap using experimental stealth technology that rendered them invisible to every known sensor type. They slipped past patrol ships and defense platforms and orbital fortresses until finally the world ender loomed before them. It was massive, a construct of metal and crystal that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. Energy pulsed through its structure like blood through veins, and at its heart a captured star was slowly being drained of its fire. Cole landed the ship in a maintenance bay and led his team into the installation. They moved through corridors that were designed for crystalline bodies, not human ones. The air was thin and cold, and everything was sharp and angular. It felt like walking through a nightmare made real. They encountered resistance almost immediately. Council security forces had been alerted to their presence somehow, and the fighting was brutal. Cole lost 3 team members in the first hour. He lost 2 more reaching the primary power core. 30 minutes, he told the survivors. Set the charges and get back to the ship. I will hold them here. Sir, we cannot leave you, Lieutenant Sarah protested. That is an order, Lieutenant. Someone has to make sure this works. He smiled despite everything. Tell them I said it was worth it. Cole took position at the entrance to the power core. His weapon hummed with charge and his hands were steady. Council soldiers poured through the doorway, and he met them with everything he had. He was one man against an army, but he was also the last line of defense between his people and annihilation. A blast caught him in the shoulder, then another in the chest. He fell but kept firing. His vision was fading and he could feel the life draining out of him, but he held on. Just a few more seconds, just long enough. The charges detonated. The world ender went dark. Across the galaxy, New Eden was saved. Captain Cole did not survive. The surviving team members escaped in the chaos that followed the weapon's failure. They carried his last words back to the fleet. They told the story of how one man had held off an army to give them the time they needed. Admiral Brooks received the news in silence. He stood at the window of his quarters looking out at the stars that Cole had died to protect. We will not forget, he said quietly. We will never forget what he gave us. The destruction of the world ender broke the Council's will to fight. Species that had supported Hal began surrendering in waves. The war that had seemed endless suddenly rushed toward its conclusion. One final battle remained. High Arbiter Hal made his last stand at the Council. It was a planet of crystal spires and ancient monuments that had been the seat of galactic government for 100,000 years. The greatest minds of countless species had walked its halls. The most important decisions in history had been made within its walls. Now it was surrounded by the remnants of a dying empire. 200 warships remained loyal to the Council. They formed a defensive sphere around the planet, prepared to die rather than surrender. Hal himself commanded from the orbital fortress that had never been breached in all the long of its existence. Admiral Brooks brought 500 ships to the final battle. The combined forces of humanity and the Free Worlds Alliance hung in space like a net waiting to close around its prey. "This is Admiral Brooks of the United Earth Fleet," he broadcast across all frequencies. "High Arbiter Hal, you are surrounded. Your weapon has been destroyed. Your allies have abandoned you. Further resistance will only result in more death. I am offering you one chance to surrender." There was a long silence. Then Hal's voice crackled through the speakers. His tone was calm, almost peaceful. "You do not understand what you are doing, Admiral. The Council has maintained order in this galaxy for 100,000 years. Without us, everything will descend into chaos. Species will war against each other as they did in the ancient times. Billions will die." "Your order was built on lies and suppression," Brooks replied. "It was never going to last. And you think you can do better. You humans with your brief lives and your violent natures. You will destroy everything we built. Maybe, or maybe we will build something better, something that does not require keeping entire species as prisoners." Brooks paused. "You have 1 hour to surrender. After that we come in." Hal did not surrender. His remaining ships launched a desperate attack that caught the human fleet off guard. The fighting was savage and close quarters, with vessels ramming each other when their weapons ran dry. It was the last gasp of an empire that refused to accept its end. The Council flagship fought until the very last moment. When human Marines breached the hull, they found Hal standing alone in his command chamber. His crystalline body was cracked and flickering. His light was fading. "It is over," the Marine commander told him. "No," Hal replied. "It is never over. You have won this battle, but you cannot change what you are. Humanity is aggressive and selfish and destructive. Eventually you will turn on yourselves as you always have. And then everything we built will burn." He shattered before they could restrain him. The pieces of his body fell to the floor like broken glass, and the light that had animated him for 100 went dark. Grace Miller walked through the ruins of the Great Chamber 2 days later. The crystalline walls were by weapons fire, and the curved benches where 17 species had once sat were empty. This was where she had stood when humanity was expelled. This was where she had promised that the Council would regret its decision. She had been right, but being right did not feel like victory. "It feels strange," she said to who walked beside her. "We won, but I cannot celebrate." "Because it is not over," he replied. "We destroyed the old order. Now we have to build something to replace it." The formation of the new Dominion was announced 6 months later. It was different from the Council in almost every way that mattered. There was no high arbiter with absolute power. There were no favored species and subordinate races. Instead, there was a representative assembly where every species, regardless of size or technological advancement, had an equal voice. The debates were loud and contentious. Species that had been enemies had to learn to work together. Ancient grievances had to be addressed. New frameworks for trade and diplomacy and mutual defense had to be negotiated from scratch. Admiral Brooks retired from military service to oversee the transition. His hair was completely gray now, and his body carried scars from wounds that had never fully healed. But his mind was still sharp, and his voice still commanded respect in any room. "This is the hard part," he told Grace one evening. "Fighting is easy. Building something that lasts is much harder." "Do you think we can do it?" she asked. "I think we have to try. The alternative is proving Hal right. Proving that humans really are just destroyers who cannot create anything permanent." Grace became the first Chancellor of the Dominion Assembly. She held the position for 20 years, guiding the new government through its difficult early days. She made mistakes, and she learned from them. She watched species that had never interacted peacefully learn to cooperate. She saw the galaxy slowly heal from the wounds of war. On Haven's Rest, Daniel Torres finally reunited with his family. He had spent 2 years in a bunker and another 3 years fighting in the Liberation Campaign. His children had grown while he was away. His daughter was 9 years old now, and she looked at him like he was a stranger. But he was patient. He had learned patience during the long years underground. He spent time with them every day, talking and playing and slowly rebuilding the bonds that distance had frayed. Eventually, his daughter climbed into his lap one evening and asked him to tell her a story. "Tell me about the war, Papa. Tell me why you had to go away." Daniel thought about everything he had seen and done. The hiding and the waiting and the fear, the battles and the death and the loss, the triumph and the sacrifice and the cost. "We were told that we did not matter," he said finally. "We were told that we were small and weak and that we should accept whatever scraps the powerful chose to give us. But we refused. We said that every person matters, every species matters, everyone deserves a chance to reach for the stars." "Did you win?" Daniel looked out the window at the evening sky. 2 moons were rising over the horizon, and between them, he could see the lights of ships moving among the stars. "We survived," he said. "We built something new. Whether we won depends on what we do next. It depends on what you do when you grow up." The memorial for Captain Cole and his team was erected at the heart of New Eden. It was a simple structure made of white stone, with 12 pillars representing the 12 people who had given everything to save humanity from destruction. The inscription read, "They gave everything so that others might live free." Below that, in smaller letters, was the motto that humanity had adopted during the darkest days of the war. "We do not yield, we do not forget, we rise." Centuries passed. The new dominion grew and changed and faced new challenges. There were conflicts and crises and moments when everything seemed about to fall apart, but somehow it endured. Somehow the seeds that humanity had planted took root and flourished. Historians would debate the true legacy of the human rebellion for generations. Some argued that the Dominion was simply another empire destined to fall as all empires do. Others believed it represented something genuinely new, a chance for the galaxy to evolve beyond the cycles of domination and submission that had defined it for so long. What no one disputed was the courage of those first generations, the humans who had refused to accept extinction, the people who had looked at an impossible situation and decided to fight anyway, the men and women who had built something from nothing and changed the course of galactic history. High Arbiter Hal had called humanity young and violent and dangerous. He had been right about all three. What he failed to understand was that these qualities properly channeled could also make humanity something else entirely. Unstoppable. In the Great Hall of the Dominion Assembly, a statue of Ambassador Grace Miller stood beside the entrance. She was depicted as she had been on that last day in the council chamber, standing alone, head held high, eyes burning with defiance. The plaque beneath her feet bore a simple inscription, the words she had spoken before walking out to change the galaxy forever. "You will regret this." They had, and humanity had made sure of it.